Hi there. Welcome to this segment of Amazing Grace. We are graced today with Dr. Carl Savage, a biblical archaeologist. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Savage. He has a master and a doctor of ministry biblical interpretation from Wesley Theological Seminary. He has an AB from someplace you might have heard of, Princeton University. He has a master's and a doctorate in religious studies and archaeology from Drew, where he spent a great part of his life. During that time, he was both director of Doctor of Divinity program, ministry program, and at the same time taught biblical archaeology, which I understand was responsible for that there. Carl, that sounds to me like you're a poster child for the term biblical archaeology. And I guess my first question would be, what came first, the chicken or the egg? You can separate those.
Interesting, yeah. So the biblical studies part actually came first, although the archaeology interest was there. I tried to, in thinking about this interview, I thought, when did I really get interested in archaeology? And it goes back to my grandmother gave me a sticker book, one of those all about sticker books. And I remember you took the pictures and you pasted them on the page. And the one that I remember is the heads, the Olmec heads, that you've seen the big giant heads, maybe. And I thought that's really interesting, and then so I had that interest from a long time. But actually, when I went to Princeton, I started out in astrophysics. So I said, I say now, I do time travel. I do time travel. It used to be I went to outer space. Now I go down in the ground. But the biblical part, I went to Wesley, did a master's degree. But during that time, I started taking classes in archaeology with Dr. Dewey Beagle, who I think Barry Davis, who we've had on before, we were in the same class. And he's the one that got me started. And when I was working with him, he was also my doctoral advisor for my DMin degree from Wesley. I asked him, where should I go to start digging? And he said, well, for your first dig, you should go to an American school or sponsored dig. And so I started with University of North Carolina with Eric and Carol Myers at Sepphoris, which is in near Nazareth in Israel. So that was my first dig, and there I learned field technique, reading pottery, the beginnings of it, and so forth. And from there, a couple years, or while I was there, actually, I heard about a site called Bethsaida that was just starting to dig. And so my next adventure in archaeology was with Bethsaida, and I'm still related to Bethsaida. I'm now the assistant director of excavations and have been that for many years now.
I'm in the Lutheran church, and in our church, you're not really ordained until you take a congregation. Have you done congregational work in your ministry, or have you?
Yeah, I'm retired from that. I was 21 years in pastoral ministry. I used to say I only served churches featured in National Geographic. So I was at Tangier Island, and then Chincoteague, and then Rocky Mount, and then the last one was in Roanoke, Northview, near Hollins College. So I served only 4 churches, but 21 years at those 4 churches.
And then you went to Drew?
Then I went to Drew.
Faculty member?
No, actually, I started out as a student because I had my DMin, but I didn't have a PhD. And in order to get any kind of audience for your work, they poo-poo the DMin, in academic circles. You have to have a PhD. So I started there kind of like a midlife crisis, left the pastorate ministry, went to the academic life. And my first year, I became associated with the Doctor of Ministry program, eventually became the director of that at Drew. But while I was doing that, I was working on my work in archaeology, particularly at Bethsaida, and looking at the first century. That's really my field, origins of Christianity and Judaism. So I like, my focus in archaeology is the first century BC and the first century AD are the main focus. Although I've worked from the early Bronze Age to Islamic period in different digs that I've done.
Archaeology, I read somewhere, you can dig in the dirt anywhere in the world. And there are all kinds of cultures out there, and there are all kinds of places to be explored. You chose biblical, and you chose a part of the world that presents a few challenges, I would imagine. Tell me about that transition to biblical.
Well, I was always...
What does that present for you that you couldn't find in the Ukraine or...
Oh, well, it's the connection with the biblical story. I mean, the biblical text. So the idea of actually uncovering things that give you context for the written word. So that I always think of the archaeology as another witness to what the Bible says. It's not interpretive in the sense that you read it, you do some textual work, and you come up with an interpretation, but this is another way of looking at what the Bible says. For example, there's a story, everyone knows it, about the 10 virgins with their oil lamp. What kind of oil lamp did they have? The text just says oil lamp. So everybody who reads that has a picture in their mind of what an oil lamp might be. A lot of times it's Aladdin's lamp, it looks like that in people's minds. So one of the things I've been working on recently has been really what type of lamp might that have been. And it turns out that most likely, and this is the way archaeology works, you never say for sure.
You never say this is.
Yeah. So I always say there's 3 P's. It's possible, probable, or possible, plausible, and probable. So, so this is, to me, the probable answer. So this is the most high certain. It's what they call a Herodian lamp. And it's an undecorated lamp. I may look for a nozzle, I can show you, but it's very distinctive. So that's the kind of lamp, for example, at Bethsaida in the first century, 90% of the lamps are Herodian lamps. It's a Jewish site, so they're all using that. So what kind of lamp did the 10 virgins hold? They probably held a Herodian oil lamp. So these little tiny lamps with the bow spouted thing, undecorated, maybe have 3 or 4 little circles on it, and that's about it. So that's the kind of thing that archaeology can do, give you that kind of background.
One of the things that I do is a lay worship leader in the church. And in preparation for that, we actually had to preach to the bishop on one occasion. And the text that I got was the curing of the cripple at Bethsaida near the pool in John. And it just kind of jumped out at me when I saw your resume here. Now I'm kind of, when I started talking to Barry, I went back and I picked out the only book I've ever read on archaeology, which is James Michener's The Source.
Oh, yeah, I've read that.
I've been looking at it, and a lot of it is quite dated now based on the relations in Israel and such. But it threw some words at me. And I'm kind of a process wonk. I want to know how things happen. What is a tell?
Well, a tell is...
Bethsaida has a tell or something like that?
Well, Bethsaida, the name that was known locally before we started calling it Bethsaida or identifying it as Bethsaida was Et Tel, which simply means the tell. So a tell is just an artificial mound that's created when people build a town and then then something happens and they build again on top of it and build again on top of it. For example, the city of Troy, that everybody knows or may know the story about the the search for the lost city of Troy. And when they found it had like 18 layers. Bethsaida doesn't have that many layers, but we've identified three really distinct layers: the New Testament period and going back into the Hellenistic period just before the New Testament period, and then an Iron Age period that start like time of David, and then a little bit earlier than David. So we have, in between, we have practically nothing. Why? Because the Assyrians probably destroyed the city when they destroyed the northern kingdom, and nobody built there until settlers came from like Tyre and Sidon, from the Phoenician coast, and settled Bethsaida to grow flax for their industries on the coast. And so, but so that you have the earliest Iron Age city, and then you build another Iron Age city on top of it, and then the destruction by the Assyrians, and then they resettled and started building again. So you get this mound kind of thing happening.
Who decides where how do you pick out that this is an area? And then the second thing is, who decides that you're allowed to dig there? That you're allowed to move in? I mean, I don't assume you get off a plane with a shovel and a pick and say, I'm going to go dig something up.
You only do that for a few days before you get arrested.
Before somebody shows up in a bad frame of mind.
So the identification for Bethsaida, well, everyone knew it was the hell. So they already knew there was something there, but why pick this particular hill? The chief archaeologist, Rami or Rav, did a site survey. And this had been done before. Or Schumacher and Gottlieb, the previous century, had done the same thing. And a site survey simply means you walk across the area, you look to see what pottery you find, and then you decide, do I want to dig here? So there was a little more than just pottery at Bethsaida. Some of the walls were also sticking out of the ground. But the pottery said there was a first century site here. Some of the pottery on the surface was from the first century. And so that's why he decided to dig there. And then what you do is you come up with a research plan. Why do you want to dig here? You apply for the license, and then you're allowed to dig.
Who do you apply to? The host country?
For Israel, each country has an antiquities authority. So in Israel,
it would be Israel for the most part.
Hmm? I'm sorry.
This would be Israel for the most part, where you're
Israel,
working?
yeah, where I've dug, mostly in Israel. I've also dug in Jordan, but mostly in Israel. So you go to the Antiquities Authority, you show them your research question, you say you can, fund the dig, you can take care of the artifacts that you find, you're going to promise to publish the results. And then you're granted a license year to year. License goes for just 1 year. And they'll come and visit. They used to visit a lot. And I remember the first time I wasn't on the license the first time, I was a supervisor. I was participating, I was directing, and they came the day that the chief archaeologist was gone to another meeting, and I was in charge, except I wasn't supposed to be in charge because I wasn't on the license. So we finally got that straightened out. But that's what they do, and they investigate what you're doing and make sure you're digging properly with controls and you're handling the artifacts correctly and so forth.
What would happen if you weren't able to dig yourself out of that particular problem? If they said, wait a minute, you're breaking our rules.
You could be arrested. You could actually
be arrested. Okay.
Yeah, because you're violating the antiquities laws, digging without a permit. That makes you a looter in a sense, if you don't you don't have a license.
How many skills have got to be brought together in order to do something? You casually say, well, it's a pottery and we tell how old it is. Somebody has to be able to look at that and understand the ceramics, I'm guessing the chemistry behind it, the effective aging on it. So is that a skill or is that a talent?
Uh, Pottery reading is kind of both. I mean, some people are better at it than others. And the reason you can read pottery by sight, and looking at the color and the shape and we always do rims, handles, and bases are the best identifiers, or a surface treatment, like it has a glaze or a painting, that sort of thing. So you can learn that. You in fact you have to, in a sense, you have to learn what rims look like, Iron Age rims, and so forth by period. And you can get pretty good. You can get within 100 years just by looking at a piece of pottery most of the time. Sometimes you'll come up with something, you go, I don't know what this is. It's like the curse and the blessing is finding something unique. So it's unique and you don't know what it is, and you can't tell what it is because it's unique. You can't compare it to something else and date it. So that's the main thing. But nowadays, you mentioned, you can tell, you can have people analyze the material, the actual ceramic material, what elements make it up, what kind of clay, how was it fired, all those kinds of things. And that's a little bit beyond, no one person can know everything. So I work with collaborators. A geologist at University of Nebraska at Omaha, for example, cut some of the pottery into thin slices so we could look at it under the microscope and see what kind of inclusions were in the fabric of the ceramic. And that helps you compare your pottery with pottery from another site. And then you can do things like X-ray, XRF, I forget what it stands for now, but it's basically X-raying the pottery with, it looks like a ray gun, and that'll tell you what elements are making up the surface of the pottery. And then you can do spectroscopy. I can't even say it. You basically dissolve the fabric, make it into a plasma, and look at the spectrum, and that tells you what elements are in the pottery. So we've done those sort of things. For example, back to the oil lamps that we started talking about, there was an article published, it's probably 20 years ago now, that said these oil lamps all come from Jerusalem. The oil lamps that you find in Jewish sites, the Herodian lamps, are all from manufactured in Jerusalem. So, but the local pottery was not like that. We knew there were regional sites where the other pottery, the household pottery, was made from. So why oil lamps from Jerusalem? So the first thing you have to do is, do the oil lamps at Bethsaida, do they come from Jerusalem or not? So how do you tell? Well, they look the same, so that's one way. But you can do knockoffs. We all know that Walmart sells the same thing that other stores do, except it's cheaper. That sort of thing. So we did spectroscopy, and we found out that it matches very closely, not exactly, but very closely within statistical distribution. So to do that, I had a professor of chemistry working with me and a statistician working with me. And the statistician did the statistical, he created created an n space of 12 dimensions to look at all these different chemicals that we were looking at. And so that he could group them together. We grouped them together. We had a few outliers, but most of them matched the Jerusalem pottery. So that's
kind of change directions a little bit. Physically, how big is the area you're digging in?
It's
site.
Yeah, it's about
some idea.
20 acres, more or less.
20, it's pretty good size.
Yeah.
How many people would you have working, actually removing dirt at one time?
So
most do you have them all in the same area, or do you have them separated? Or
well, because you can only have like 3 or 4 people. We divide everything up into squares, and a square is 5 by 5 meters, at least to start. Okay. And then when you find something, you may subdivide it and so forth, and it gets smaller, 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 or you combine some and it becomes larger. But basically 5 by 5 meters, maybe 4 or 5 people work in that area. The most we ever had, we had 85 people working one year, 15 different squares. Okay, that's a lot of people at one time. We had to have 2 shifts for breakfast, all this kind of thing. Most of the time we have between 15 and 30 people. So we'll open 4 or 5 squares in different areas, depending on what we want to research. So the area I've been working in is A West, which it's just our designation. You divide the tell up into different areas. And A West, we were looking for the last 10 years at a large courtyard house. And so we were digging from the north end, and we continued all the way to the south end, and then down below to the Iron Age level. In other words, we dug through most of the house to see what was underneath, because we knew that the first century layer was on top of something. You know, part of the problem is archaeology is when do you
So you're making a decision, do I want to wreck this to get to the next?
Yeah. So
there is some destruction that happens when you go below.
It's always destructive. So you have to decide what is your research question and where do you stop. So at Bethsaida, we have 2 kind of major research questions. What did it look like in the New Testament times? And then what did it look like in the time of David? Because it looks very different between the 2 times. It's a big walled city in the Iron Age, huge walls, 3 meters wide, 9 feet wide, sometimes 12 feet wide, with huge towers. But in the New Testament time, they may have used part of the wall, but it's not nearly as thick and so forth. So it looks quite different, and the house style is different. In the New Testament times, there's a lot of large courtyard houses, and we hope to find someday where the common people live, because not everybody lived in these huge mansions, these large courtyard houses. If you've ever gone to Capernaum, you'll see the smaller type of houses that we think the typical people the average person would have lived in the smaller houses. We have one that's fairly extended, that side we call the apartment. It's just 2 rooms, but it's clearly a first century house because of what we found inside of it.
I'm assuming that a fairly key person someplace along the line has got to be a photographer.
Oh, yes.
I would assume that as you're going to stop and say, I know that I don't know much about that, but I know that they say, don't touch it till we've taken a picture of it.
Right, exactly. So photography, it used to be film photography. So you really said, do I really want a picture of this or not? Nowadays with digital photography, you photograph everything. So one of my, back when I was still a PhD student, I got a grant to digitize finds at Bethsaida. And I was one of the first ones to do this. Back, my camera cost, hundreds of dollars, and your phone takes better pictures than the original digital camera we used. But we started photographing all the pottery shards that we kept, what we call the diagnostics, the ones that helped us date where we were digging or told us what kind of materials in there. So for example, these rims are all cooking pots and storage jars. This is a domestic space, or these are all fancy, imported ware. These may show us there's an elite person living there. But so now we photograph them digitally, so you don't have to go dig up the bags to see what you found there. You can just pull up the picture, which is now a good thing, because a lot of the pottery, most of the pottery we found at Bethsaida is now, if you've ever seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's in a storage area like that it'd be hard to get to look at now.
This is, I think, kind of obvious, but anything that you find, you don't take home to New Jersey. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. So interesting story.
If you find one of those lamps, it's not going home in the baggage compartment.
So interesting story. When I was in Roanoke, still serving in church at the time, even though I started to become involved in archaeology, the local archaeological society asked me to come speak about Bethsaida. So I did. And after the lecture I gave, they asked me the same question you just asked. Can you take, material home? Now, we used to joke, you find a gold coin, you can keep a silver one, but it was just a joke. You know what I'm saying? And I said to them, of course, no, you can't. It all belongs to in our case, the state of Israel. And they said, well, what about this? And they plopped down a news article about these people that were working over there and had brought back all this stuff. And I go, you can't do that. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, they got a knock on the door from the FBI and the Israeli Antiquities Authority working together, and were arrested for smuggling, even though what they had done wasn't exactly smuggling, but they had kept artifacts from the dig they were working on as volunteers and so forth.
There's got to be a thin line between a souvenir and something of importance.
Now, if, for example, we told our volunteers all the time, we throw out the pottery that we're not going to keep in the breakfast area, and we say you can pick up shards there and take them home because they're just shards. They're valuable. I don't know if I should be saying this or not, because I'm not really sure you're allowed to do it. But no one's ever gotten in trouble for taking shards like that home. Sometimes we do take artifacts, from Israel to the States for study. Like, for example, when I did the study of the oil lamp nozzles, I brought some of them to the States to take samples for the ICP study and the XRF studies. So, but then they go back after you're done using them for the study. We also have someone.
I'm going to shift directions again,
Sure.
Just for a couple more minutes in this segment. As I listen to all of this, these visions of dollar bills go through my mind. Talk about how this is financed. Who pays what? Where does it come from? Because this has got to be an ungodly amount of money at some point in time.
Yeah, it is a lot, but not. It's a lot and not a lot at the same time. If you were a millionaire, you could fund a dig, every year. The way we're funded is either through grants that we develop or the school. For example, Bethsaida is a consortium, so schools would pay a consortium fee, a couple $1,000s. But when you have a lot of schools, they add up to enable us to begin funding, and then the volunteers pay their own way. So they're not really an expense because they're paying for their room and board and so forth to be able to dig. We always had an expression, what's the difference between a volunteer and a slave? And the difference is you paid to do this.
You paid to do this. You paid to go over there and work in 104-degree heat and dig in the dirt. We pretty much used up what is a normal segment for our show. So I think I want to shut down here for a minute. I'm going to ask you if we can come back, and I'd like to talk to you about the day-to-day. What's the day like when you're on a dig?
Sure.
When does it start? How miserable is it? What's the worst thing that happened to you? So if that's okay with you, I think we'll say goodbye for this point in time, and then meet her again in a minute and a half.
Okay. All right.
Thanks much. Take care.